Hello, good morning to everyone. Uh, I want to start thanking my presentation, Professor Catherine Hui and Hui of Malaysian Finance Association for inviting me to give this keynote address. And today I'm going to talk about convergence of ethical and Islamic finance. I'm given 45 minutes. So I have structured my presentation in 3 ways: to give you a snapshot of what is ethical and Islamic finance, and talk about one of my recent empirical work, and finally shed some light on the future of Islamic finance as well. So the sustainable, responsible, ethical financing is estimated to be $30 trillion in the world right now. Compared to SRI financing, the universal Islamic finance estimated size about 2 trillion to 3 trillion in different estimates. Now, how does Islamic finance help bring value to the society? First of all, Islamic finance advocates trust, cooperation, and solidarity. Instead of advocating greed and competition, it prescribes compassion and cooperation. It requires balance between individual rights and the rights of others in the society. It advocates doing good is encouraged. It does not subscribe to encroachment on anyone's property rights. It promotes fairness and comprehensive human development. And as a result, Islamic finance stimulates economic activity, entrepreneurship, and address poverty and inequality in the society. So Islamic finance and as an ethical finance both address the several aspects of millennial sustainable development goals. Now, if you look at in a microcosm or in a more detailed way, the difference between these two types of finance, ethical and Islamic finance, we can start from the value proposition. In the ethical finance, the value proposition is outlined in the stated intent. The environmental sustainability is one of the goals. Islamic finance, of course, the root is in the Quran and the writings of our Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Now, the way it addresses environmental sustainability, the clear articulation on environmental consideration only began following the Brundtland Report 1987, which defines ESG investing, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And how does Islamic finance address it? Do good and prevent harm by treating the environment in a fair and just manner, moderation, avoiding wastage and excesses, treat every living human being with mercy and duty of care to protect and keep safe for the next generation. And what are the methodologies adopted by ethical and Islamic finance? In ethical finance, different treatment process. It talks about negative screening. It talks about ESG integration, of course, shareholder activism. On the other hand, Islamic finance talks about sector screening, or we call this moral filtering, and entity screening or financial screening in order to determine what is Islamic or not Islamic. So how does ethical finance contribute to financial stability? Ethical finance has a longer term orientation. It avoids short-term transactions, avoid high risk and speculative activities. Of course, it integrates ESG framework with high level of disclosure and transparency and emphasis on ethics, culture, and values. Now, Islamic finance, the similar way contributes to financial stability because of the elements of Islamic finance itself is uh, naturally lead to financial stability. The requirement that financial transactions be supported by real economic activity, profit and loss sharing, have a built-in risk management ability. It has a robust governance process and transparency, and of course, it avoids speculative or illegal activities. So, both ethical and Islamic finance share some common goals. They have long term orientation and sustainability. They have financial inclusion. They embed ethical values in their financial practices, and they look after the economic well-being of everyone, not just certain segment of the population. Of course, it preserves interest for the next generation. That's why the climate is one of the very important aspect of ethical and Islamic finance as well. So what does the evidence show? There was a study done by Refinitiv. It asked the question, can Sharia compliance screening significantly improve environmental, social, and governance performance? And the study shows the ESG score integration with Sharia compliance 6% higher for Sharia compliant financial companies and 10% higher for Sharia compliant non-financial companies. So what does it say? When you integrate Sharia and ESG screening, they show some correlation, and combining these two can improve the overall risk-adjusted returns, and greater focus on ESG specific screening on the top of Sharia screening would minimize risk from such exposure. And second part of my address, I detail an empirical analysis when I show that ethical investing or ESG integration with Sharia screening indeed do help using a wide set of financially compliant or Islamically compliant data and non-Islamic compliant data of the stocks. So what is the link between ESG and Sharia compliance and performance? Both Sharia compliance screening and ESG screening create portfolios with similar characteristics. As I said before, combining both screens can add significant new information. And Islamic banks face indirect environmental risk based on types of economic activities they finance, and it can factor in environmental and social risk into its change to reduce the risk exposure. And it can also influence clients to adopt their risk mitigation techniques. So, what is a formal definition of ethical investing? Investment impact investment refer to allocation of funds into society and environmental friendly projects with an intention to generate economic profits as well as to create significant social and environmental impact. Impact investor may have one of three major characteristics: creating social and environmental effects while earning the required rate of return. And the primary objective is to serve the societal and environmental needs, making the required financial profits while generating measurable environmental, social, and governance impact. Primary objective is to earn economic profits, and joining collaborative investment initiative to develop infrastructure for ESG financing and impact investment. And the fundamental objective is to serve as a catalyst. And the role of Islamic finance in impact investing, um, to play a more effective intermediation function and display better asset quality. Now, Islamic finance can serve as a better outcome to human well-being through providing sufficient efforts and risk sharing and socially responsible activities, include responsible financing, embracing ethical investment, social impact financing, helping to alleviate poverty, providing socioeconomic security to the people. An Islamic financial institution committed to more focus on Islamic social paradigm activities instead of being stuck in commercial intermediary functions. Now, the acceleration screening is the most common ESG method used by Islamic finance. So the way the Islamic finance stands right now, they emphasize more on negative screening than positive screening. But integrating ESG into Islamic finance will allow to emphasize more on positive screening as well. For example, Islamic finance uses screening to avoid financing business built on riba, excessive gharar, alcohol, adult entertainment, or gambling. And Islamic equity investing, further exclusion screening is applied based on the proportion of imperishable income and the leverage of the companies. So the first one is called um, moral filter or sector screening, and the second filter is called financial filter. Like, for example, companies with permissible income of more than 5% of total income or debt level more than 33% of the book value or market capitalization are excluded. Exclusion screening in Islamic finance may vary depending on how the ratios are defined and calculated. Tobacco provides an interesting case in Islamic exclusion screening. Tobacco consumption is not directly associated with prohibition in the primary sources of Islam. The modern Islamic finance prohibits business associated with it because smoking is injurious to health. So what are the similarities between SRI and Islamic finance? Socially responsible investing. Both approaches have a strong ethics foundation. Their commonalities include a concern for human rights and the environment, a focus on long-term sustainability and success, and avoidance of excessive, aggressive leverage. A research report on Islamic finance ESG consideration suggests a direct correlation between Sharia compliance and higher ESG scores, as I mentioned before. So, are there any standards and guidelines to help this both ethical finance and Islamic finance? Of course, there are. There are several principles, standards, and conventions. An associated advocacy organization serve as a common reference point for investors considering ESG issues. So you have the United Nations Global Compact, you have the OECD guideline for multiple enterprises, you have the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance, and of course you have the principles for responsible investment. Now, these bodies' publication influence practices in both SRI and Islamic finance, and the development of Islamic finance has also benefited from standard setting bodies. Most prominent body is AOFI, and AOFI has a standard on corporate social responsibility, known as Corporate Social Responsibility Conduct Disclosure for Islamic Financial Institution. And this standard lays out mandatory and voluntary conduct and serves as a common reference point in Islamic finance. So the ethical bridge between these two types of finance, ethical, SRI, and Islamic finance, you avoid harm and do good. This bridge is built on the shared concern about society and environment, as well as his historical connection. Historically, similarities between Islamic investing and SR investing are most visible with respect to traditional faith-based, socially responsible investing in the United States that use similar exclusion screening on similar industries. There are modern examples of financial services providers who have been able to create offerings that both meet Islamic prohibition and consider ESG considerations. Amana mutual funds in the United States seek companies that demonstrate both Islamic and sustainable characteristics. The fund's literature defines sustainable issuers as those that are most established, consistently profitable, financially strong, and following robust ESG policies. Setco Capital, one of the largest asset managers in Saudi Arabia, combines traditional Islamic screening with modern ESG consideration. It describes this as its prudent ethical approach and believes that it leads to financial outperformance. And some examples Sukuk meet advanced ESG criteria. In 2017, a green sukuk was issued in Malaysia, raising $59 million to finance a solar power plant. The Sukuk was issued under the Malaysia's SRI Sukuk framework and endorsed by the Sharia Advisory Council of Securities and Exchange Commission. The issue benefited from independent review and a dark green rating by Center for International Climate and Environmental Research in Oslo, Norway. Now, the main drivers of signatory growth in OIC countries are the strong alignment of social objectives and responsible investment and Islamic finance, and the additional financial value of integrating ESG factors into investment process, which can be combined with Sharia screening. Bank Nijwa, a fast-growing Islamic bank in Oman, has distinguished itself by embedding social and economic empowerment in its financing and by enabling its staff to participate in charitable activities. Now, these examples illustrate that providers of financial services can create offerings that will qualify as both Islamic and SRI investing. But wait, there are also problems with the ESG investing and the scores and the factors that you use. There's a recent book by Edward Advance, 2020, Grow the Pie. He talks about the investors are increasingly scrutinizing the ESG performance of companies. This is a positive development. If the CEO know that investors evaluate them on ESG factors, not just short-term earnings, they will prioritize these factors over quarterly profit. The investor recognize that quarterly earnings are a less relevant measure of performance for companies that take their social impact seriously. But one major challenge is that it's very difficult to measure ESG performance. This challenge may be why some investors focus on short-term financial metrics on evaluating a company. For that reason, ESG rating companies such as MSCI, Sustainalytics, Vigo Iris, ISS, RobocoSAM, and Asset4 can play a major positive role. However, there are inconsistent ESG ratings. ESG rating agency produce an overall ESG score as well as scores for the individual components E, S, and G separately. The different rating agencies disagree substantially on a company's ESG performance. The correlation between ESG ratings across different providers is around 0.3, whereas it contradicts with credit ratings agencies where the correlation between the ratings by S&P and Moody's is around 0.99. Of course, we know there is an investor horizon in ESG preference, so there is a trade-off there. Theories suggest that an important determinant of investor performance for corporate ESG is the investment horizon. While some investors pursue a short-term oriented strategy designed to realize trading profits in relatively brief time periods, other investors allow more patience in the trading decision, which can consider share price appreciation over a long period of time. Since some of the ESG activities could improve long-term corporate performance while incurring short-term costs, there is a natural trade-off between the valuation of such projects from the perspective of short-term versus long-term investors. And ESG projects may be detrimental to short-term earnings, which create the most speculation. Short-term shareholders can be inclined to avoid firms with more ESG activities. So the divergence of ESG ratings, it decomposes the disagreement into three sources in one of the recent paper by Bark, Colwell, and Rigobon. They investigate the divergence of ESG ratings based on data from 6 prominent rating agencies, namely KLD, MSCI Stats, Sustainalytics, Vigo Iris, Moody's, RobocoSAM, S&P Global, Asset4, Refinitiv, and MSCI. The divergence into three core sources, different scope of categories, different measurement of categories, and different weights of categories. And they find the scope and measurement divergence are the main drivers, while weight divergence is less important. They also detect a rare rater effect, whereas the rater's overall view of a firm influences the assessment of specific categories. They show that measurement factors are 50% due mainly to raters measure all these rating agencies the same ESG attribute to different indicators. For example, labor practices could be evaluated based on the workforce turnover or the number of labor cases against them. Female friendliness could be measured by the gender pay gap, the percentage of women on the board, or the percentage of women in the workforce. The scope of 44% is due to different raters include different attributes. Most raters consider a firm's greenhouse gas emission when evaluating its environmental record, but only some will include electromagnetic radiation. One rating agency may include lobbying, other might not, and weight 3% is due to different raters place different weights on the individual components when calculating the overall score based on their philosophy, what constitutes an SRI investing or what constitutes a valid ESG factor. So therefore, investors should select the provider whose ratings align more closely with the investor's own views on ESG. There is another study, Lee and Polychronopoulos, 2020. Now they tell that ESG ratings vary markedly by ESG ratings provider because each provider has a unique methodology for assigning company-specific ratings, like the previous study I mentioned. Investors must ensure the approach taken by the ratings provider they rely on is consistent with the ESG preferences or the risk constructing portfolios that do not align with their ESG views. Now, ESG portfolio constructing using the ratings of two well-known ESG ratings provide their EL large performance dispersion and low correlation of returns, and the difference are even greater at the individual rating level for environmental, social, and governance scores. So difference is how ratings providers calculate ESG scores can result in the same company being ranked quite highly by one provider and quite poorly by another. And understanding which metrics are evaluated and how they are assessed is essential to investors selecting stocks that meet the ESG criteria they care about. So these authors specifically give an example, compare Wells Fargo and Facebook and show clearly that each rating provider takes a unique approach based on perspective, its philosophy, varying both the particular metrics they evaluate to varying how they categorize the matrices among the individual environmental E, social S, and governance criteria. Provider 1 ranks Wells Fargo as top quartile in governance, while provider 2 ranks in its bottom 5%. That's because provider 1 counts the fake bank account scandal within information to customers, which is part of a social score, not governance score. Provider 1 gives Facebook a top 10% environmental rating, while provider 2 ranks it in the bottom 30%. That's because the environmental ratings measure quite different attributes, and each attribute has different weights. Now the question remains, does socially responsible investing make financial sense? Now the socially responsible investing has come a long way from the days when it mostly meant not buying the shares of companies in controversial industries such as tobacco, firearms, alcohol, or gambling. Now investors who favor this approach routinely consider a broad range of corporate behavior under the umbrella of so-called ESG factors, environmental, social, and governance, as in corporate governance. For many investors, socially responsible investing is now a guiding principle. The number of mutual funds and exchange-traded funds catering to those investors has mushroomed in recent years, with industry heavyweights BlackRock Incorporated and Goldman Sachs Group prominent among those launching funds last year. What is the evidence? The evidence is clear that investors undervalue socially responsible firms And if you look at the growth factor in 2005 to 2014, from less than 200, the number of funds has grown to 1,000. Net asset value in 2005, less than 1 trillion. It is now over 3 trillion. So socially responsible investing makes financial sense precisely because many investors incorrectly think that it doesn't. And so they undervalue socially responsible companies. That means bargains are available for astute investors. Now, the only catch on when its effects show up on the bottom line for everyone to see, but then it's too late. The stock price has already risen. Traditional investing focuses on tangible measures of companies' value, such as profiles and sales growth, but but those measures are easy for anyone to see and understand, and so they are already reflected in the stock price. In contrast, social responsibility is intangible, so investors have a particularly hard time valuing it. How do you measure the value of a company's environmental stewardship? As a result, traditional investors mostly ignore company social responsibility. As I mentioned two recent papers, the dichotomy and the inconsistency and the divergence among rating agencies to rate different companies on ESG scores. So is a convergence point between SRI and Islamic finance? Doing more on ESG issues is helpful to Islamic finance in addressing the criticism leveled against it for putting legal technicalities of Islamic commercial jurisprudence over economic and moral substance. And Islamic finance has been learning and will continue to learn from developments in SRA investing and will adopt accordingly. The reverse, that is SRA investing adopting Islamic finance conservatism, is less likely to happen because the financial conservatism built in Islamic finance prohibition does not feature prominently among the priorities of SRI investing customers and providers in its core markets. That said, the better the Islamic finance becomes at managing ESG issues, the more likely it is to be accepted as the part of the SRI, SDG, and ESG universe. Now, setting the ground and giving you a sort of 101 of ethical investing and Islamic finance, let's give you an empirical exercise that we have done, a paper we have completed, the crossroads of ESG and religious screening on the farm risk, with a few of my colleagues from Italy, Laura, Andrea, Alberto, and Stefano. So what was the motivation of our study? As I said, there is a growing interest in Islamic corporate finance and CSR, and the concept of CSR is theoretically embedded in Islam. And Islam and CSR, there are similarities within ethical investment, but also differences in practices, screenings, because the different raters in the Islamic finance universe rates the financial screening differently. And there is no study that investigate the interaction between CSR and Sharia screening, and benefits of ESG screening, as I told in the first part of my lecture, is huge. Now, the research question that we're addressing in this exercise, whether Sharia compliance enhances the risk mitigating effect of ESG engagement on market risk of non-financial firm, distinguishing systematic and idiosyncratic risk, identifying ESG subpillars and categories provide greater benefits to Sharia compliant firms. And there's a size of literature finds a negative relationship between CSR and farm risk, cost of debt, cost of equity, cost of capital, dividend policy. Now, Islamic corporate finance literature is very shallow. There are few studies came out recently, certification effect of Sharia compliance in lowering cost of capital, in affecting stock market valuation of bond offerings, in influencing credit ratings, an Islamic level effect in Sharia compliance firms' style of managers in taking financial decisions. So what is the contribution of this study? We extend the literature on Islamic corporate finance and CSR by studying the combined effect of Sharia and ESG screenings, the ability of Sharia compliant firms to benefit from stronger risk mitigating effect at higher levels of ESG engagement, about ESG, the effects of sub-pillars on Islamic firms' market risk, and theoretical contributions on agency stakeholder and portfolio theories applied to Islamic firms. Now, theoretical work, as I laid down in the first part of my lecture, is CSR, ESG, and S are difficult to define. We proxy CSR through ESG score, a useful metric for invest sensitive to SRI, including Sharia compliance. So definitive ESG score we apply in this study. There are similarities and differences, as I said, between Islamic finance and SRI in my previous slides. But there are also differences. Islamic portfolio excludes conventional sectors and input screening to ensure proper threshold of debt and cash. It may include fossil fuels, do not necessarily screen for human rights. Our idea is that screening can be integrated. That means Sharia compliance, Sharia finance, and ESG can be integrated to create portfolios. And they may have portfolio restrictions increasing risk, but at the same time, they will add benefits excluding controversial industries or enhancing environmental concern. Both the portfolio and the agency theories predict a negative outcome from CSR Islamic screening, whereas the shareholder theory attributes to engagement in such activities a positive result. CSR, the additional non-financial screening increase searching and monitoring costs or lower diversification opportunities, leading to lower returns or higher volatility. Agency issues in firms to hide management behavior. But the stakeholder theory, screenings are likely to have a positive impact since they allow the selection of financially stronger and more stable and more profitable companies. So we develop a number of hypotheses. Our first hypothesis is ESG scores, irrespective of compliance to Sharia principle, are negatively associated with market risk, both as a composite score and when broken down in sub-pillar or categories. In Islamic firms, screenings with negative effects on performance and positive on risk due to searching and monitoring cost and more concentration. On the other side, more stable and financially stronger firms and positive stockholder effects. Our hypothesis 2, Sharia compliance, irrespective of the level of ESG score, is positively associated with market risk of firms. And CHOE 2012 find that membership in an ethical index is far more affected by what firms say, ethical disclosure, rather than what they do. And the third hypothesis, high levels of ESG score are associated with a stronger risk mitigating effect in Sharia compliant firms. So Sharia compliant firms engages in ESG practices should improve their liquidity, exclude high leverage or excessive uncertainty, or include screenings that mitigate market risk. So where do you get your data? We include the listed non-financial firms with non-missing values for ESG score Sharia certification, 4,624 non-financial firms with an ESG score, of which 1,917 are Sharia compliant and 2,707 are not. They are conventional firms. As I say, source of data, Thomson Reuters Refinitiv database. Period is most recent, 2002 to 18. Extensive and global data set that covers the following continents: Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, North America, and Oceania. Our main findings, we find that cost efficiency during the normal times helps firms reduce failure probabilities, decrease risk, enhance profitability during subsequent financial crisis, while profit efficiency has limited benefits. This result suggests that cost efficiency better measures management quality, while profit efficiency may partially reflect temporary higher returns during the normal times from risky investment. Our results strongly suggest that policymakers, regulators, supervisors, and managers pay attention to cost efficiency during normal times, which may promote better financial crisis outcomes. And what is our methodology? We use a pooled OLS regression with time, industry, and region fixed effect. Our dependent variable market risk, standard deviation monthly stock returns of the previous year, market model for idiosyncratic and systematic risk to calculate different types of risk on the left-hand side variable. And the variable of interest is ESG score and the dummy Sharia with their interaction. So if you look at this equation, you have the ESG score here and ESG and interaction with the Sharia. Now, we also take care or address the endogeneity in our study to control for the sample selection bias. We use a Hackman two-step method to address endogeneity in the form of reverse causality. We use an instrumental variable two-stage risk scores model. And to further address endogeneity between CSR and farm risk, we use 2008 and 9 financial crisis as an unexpected exogenous event. So we also do a triple different interaction term, high ESG, Sharia, and crisis. As I said, our subsample focuses on North America, EU, and Asia. We use propensity score matching, comparing equity risk of Sharia compliant and conventional firms, and other subsamples for ESG score levels, lower, high levels, farm size, larger and smaller, and stage of development of the reference country, emerging versus developed country. And what are our results? ESG scores are able, regardless of Sharia compliance, to reduce market risk. This risk mitigating effect occurs for both the idiosyncratic risk and the systematic risk, despite being stronger for the later, that means systematic risk. And Sharia compliance, regardless of the level of a firm's ESG score, increases all measures of firm risk, especially the systematic component. The interaction term shows that for high levels of ESG scores or subpillars, the risk mitigating effect on Sharia compliant firm is stronger than for conventional firms, resulting in lower levels of market risk. So actually, reconfirm the repetitive study, but with a much more higher, longer, and granular data set. So there are some results from the paper itself. We have the total risk, idiosyncratic risk, and systematic risk. So if you look at ESG star Sharia, these are negative for total risk and significant idiosyncratic risk, negative, significant, but for systematic risk is not. And we also provide the result for individual ESG pillars and components and sub-pillars in the interaction. Environment and social are highly correlated with risk reduction for social compliant firms. However, we do not detect in statistically significant association with the interaction of the Sharia compliance and governance. The main drivers of risk mitigating role of ESG score, regardless of the firm being Sharia compliant or not, are resource use and emission for environment, workforce and product responsibility for social, and management and CR strategy for governance. And robustness checks confirms our main results regarding financial crisis. Both Sharia compliant and high ESG score firms are negatively correlated during the financial crisis, confirming our baseline findings. Secondly, high ESG scores tend to be riskier during the financial crisis when resources become more valuable. Agency conflicts such as an overinvestment concerns become more severe. Johnson 2000. And the negative association between risk and ESG scores holds across subsamples, mainly for larger firms and for developed countries. Now, what is our overall conclusion and policy implication? Like before, as I said in the first part of my lecture, we contribute to the literature by linking the CSR and the Islamic corporate finance. We document for the first time the role played by Sharia compliance regarding the market risk of non-financial firms, and Sharia compliant firms receive on average higher ESG total and individual scores, and it mitigates the effect of ESG scores in reducing market risk for all firms. When Sharia compliance is considered, regardless of ESG scores, the prevailing effect is a traditional portfolio theory prediction of an increase in market risk, possibly confirming concern about lower diversification, higher screening, monitoring cost, and stronger agency issues. However, as ESG score increase, the risk mitigating effect is stronger for Sharia compliant firms than for conventional ones, leading to a lower final level of market risk for firms highly committed to CSR. And the attractiveness of Sharia compliant entities that are highly engaged in CSR in terms of response to market risk. So that is second part of my. So now I'm to the third section of my presentation. So what is the future of Islamic finance? Now, Islamic finance is rooted in divine law, prohibition of harmful transactions. It's about economic justice for all humanity, circulation of wealth, interest concentrated wealth. That's why riba has been forbidden in the Holy Book. Commoditization, backed by real assets for real growth. Risk sharing does not transfer risk to the borrower. So if we compare lending in a debt-based economy and investing in ethical equity-based economy, what are the difference? In a lending-based, win-or-lose framework is a zero-sum game, but it's a win-win framework, positive-sum game in an ethical equity-based economy. It creates debt in a traditional banking, but it invests in real assets in ethical equity-based framework. Risk is transferred in lending, but risk is shared is investing on the ethical sphere. Unfair gains for profit and losses, just and fair profit and losses in the ethical framework. Rich gets richer, poor gets poorer, but in investing world that follows ethical investing and Islamic Sharia, just and equity for everyone. So what are the main components of Islamic economics? Muslims are not only discouraged but also forbidden from investing in businesses that are engaged in illicit activities. Trade, not banking, is a primary function of markets. Islam prohibits paying or receiving any predetermined fixed rate of return on borrowed or lent money. Charging interest, we call riba, tends to drive the poor into more poverty and create more wealth for wealthy. And Muslims are strictly forbidden from investing or in dealing with economic activities that involve interest, uncertainty, and speculation. So, what are the key intrinsic principles of Islamic finance? Now, it starts with so if you look at this circular diagram, so Islamic financial industry. So you start with economic justice. It is a regulatory control, corporate governance, debt cannot be sold, greater reliance on equity. One cannot sell or lease unless one possesses it. It's ban on interest, sold or leased assets must be real, no pain, no gain, no ambiguity or speculative activities, ethical or socially responsible investing, and proper risk management. There are 4 points I want to emphasize in Islamic finance. Riba is prohibited. What is the intuition behind it? Earning money from money or interest is prohibited. Profit, or we call risk sharing finance, which is created when money is transformed into capital by effort, is allowed. However, some forms of debt are permitted where these are linked to real transactions and where this is not used for purely speculative purposes. So what is the connection to the market failure of this paradigm? A real return for real effort is emphasized. Investment cannot be too safe, while speculation is discouraged. Investment cannot be too risky. This might have productive efficiency spillover benefits, positive externalities for the economy through linking returns to real entrepreneurial effort. Second concept, fair profit sharing. What is the intuition behind it? Symmetric profit sharing or musharaka and mudaraba is the preferred contract form. providing effort incentives for the manager of a venture, while both the investor and management have a fair share in the venture's realized profit or loss. How it connects with market failure. By aligning the management incentives with those of the investor, in contrast to pure debt financing, once again have productive efficiencies spillover benefits for the economy through linking realizable returns to real entrepreneurial effort. No undue ambiguity or uncertainty. What is the intuition behind it? No agora, no uncertainty. The principle aims to eliminate activities or contracts that are agora by eliminating exposure of either party to excessive risk. The investor and the manager must therefore be transparent in writing the contract. One of the longest verses in the Quran is about contract. Must take steps to mitigate controllable risk and avoid speculative activities with high levels of uncontrollable risk. How it connects to market failure. This may limit the extent to which there are imperfect and asymmetric information problem as part of profit sharing arrangement, because many people say that there is asymmetric information in equity-based contract. Information problems might, for example, provide the conditions for opportunist behavior by venture, moral hazard, undermining investment in all similar ventures in the first instance. And finally, halal versus haram sectors. What is the intuition behind it? Investing in certain haram sectors is prohibited since they are considered to cause individual as well as collective harm from the societal standpoint. How it connects with market failure, arguably in certain sectors, there are negative effects for society that the investor venture might not otherwise take into account, like negative externalities. Like, for example, pornography is bad. So if there is a societal or national regulation to contain this activity, it benefits everyone. Prohibiting investment in these sectors might limit these negative externalities. So, what were the objectives of this alternate Islamic financial system? Islamic finance was initially launched to avoid interest-bearing system, to promote equity-based financing, to share profit and loss among various stakeholders, to avoid a priori fixed return so the business return can be attached to risk, and to place productivity at the center of the financing. But where it is heading now? The practice of Islamic banking industry did not follow the idealist of these pioneers. The system has relied heavily on undesirable contracts, almost like debt-like or mimicking conventional financial products. There has been a shift in ideology connecting fixed return to PLS-based system. Some of these ideological shifts are rolled out by early advocates of Islamic finance. A number of theoretical compromises are made by third generation of Islamic financial experts and Sharia scholars, the practice that we see now. This approach, of course, could not result in the alternative of the conventional system. Rather, it leads to integration of Islamic financial system within the conventional one. Here we made the choice. The recent scholars, Sharia permissibility sets upon procedures, not outcomes. This procedure compliance largely explains why Islamic banking was stuck in form, ignoring substance, versus the idealist. Sharia was revealed by God to protect some key objectives called objective of the Sharia or maqasid of Sharia, hence looking for the process compliance such that to negate those underlying objectives is uncalled for by Sharia, and consequently the practitioners that you see today, because Islamic banking has to compete with conventional one in a mixed system, it is necessary for Islamic banks to have efficient and attractive products, as Islamic banks would fail as most of the bank customers look for procedure equivalence. So we need to relook into few areas, redesigning the banking objectives in line with the social needs, promoting small entrepreneurship, connecting Islamic bank to Islamic social activities, regulatory sufficiency, harmonization of policies and practices across border, and awareness and education. So we need to focus more on Islamic social finance and rather than Islamic commercial finance, Yes, both can be complement to each other, and we have to combine this in holistic way in order to provide the greater benefits to the society. My last slide. So what are the challenges and how we can mitigate those challenges one more time? I promise this is my last slide. So there is a communication gap in the Islamic finance industry. Misconceptions, misunderstanding, and misplaced notions about Islamic finance must be removed through awareness and advocacy program. We have a trust gap. Social business and impact investing should be emphasized to remove tensions among stakeholders of the Islamic finance industry. Innovation gap, balance between macro and micro maqasid should be maintained. The so-called form versus substance debate, as a result, the whole area of financial engineering. And finally, talent gap, a new brand of scholars who are well-versed in Islamic jurisprudence and secular financing techniques and mechanisms must be nurtured. So the educational institutions has a critical role to play in developing the new generation of Islamic finance scholars or the scholars, regardless whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, to to develop this Islamic finance industry further for the development of the entire human being. So, my dear friends and the participants, thank you very much. I hope you like my presentation. And if you have any question, you can always reach out to me and I'll happy to discuss any question and concerns that you have. Thank you very much. Enjoy. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.